Welcome back to Scale Model Workshop and my final segment regarding the Airfix Spitfire FR Mark 14. In this video, I want to present my approach to converting the kit to an earlier Mark F14 with the more familiar Spitfire hood. But before I do, I want to clear up some confusion. In the first video, I deviated from the instructions in how I assembled the cockpit. I routinely do this with any cockpit that has a split tub that lacks precision. But in the case of this kit, there's some additional external fit issues that, in order to fix, make it necessary to have access to the areas that would be blocked by the cockpit. In addition, I need to have the cockpit removable during the conversion process, so in both cases, I didn't follow the instruction sequence. For those that might be new to my channel or not followed me on my previous channel, I frequently present material that builds on techniques that I've talked about earlier. Because I do so much scratch building, it helps to have a bag of diverse skills that I can apply wherever I need them, and this model and conversion offer a good opportunity to bring some of them together. For instance, in the last video, I demonstrated the basic idea of how to improve the fit of the cover over the forward oil and fuel tanks. However, I was remiss in following through on the actual final mounting. This was partly due to the fact that I was still working out the conversion, so let me walk through the finishing of the tank cover. If you've seen my videos The Shadow Nose and Scribing Panel Lines, you know that I'm not a fan of flooding a panel joint with liquid cement and then trying to establish separation with some sort of wash or stain, especially in situations like this where there's an actual separation that we can take advantage of. So in this case, I used a thick mix of cyanoacrylate and acrylic resin. This prevents cement from finding its way into the joint, so the joint remains intact, it's not softened by solvent cement, and it's more resistant to the stresses that were introduced when spreading the panel. Here again, if the cockpit was already cemented in place, the forward bulkhead and instrument panel would be in the way. Once the panel's set, it can be fine-tuned, blending the height at the top of the fuselage and using the method that I describe in my raised panel video to establish a more precise overhang at the base. Here I'm using a piece of FBS fine line tape, and you can see that it mics out at 5/1000ths of an inch, or a little shy of 1/4 of an inch in 48 scale. The tape is placed at the base of the panel and makes the perfect guide for establishing a consistent edge that's square and sharp. And as you can see, it casts a nice realistic shadow without some sort of artificial enhancement. Here you can see a prototypical example. However, as an aside, I would generally caution against using a restored aircraft as proof, because these panels are frequently replaced. Although you can see, even in this poorly reproduced image of an operational Spitfire, the characteristic shadow displayed around the slightly raised outline. Also note the same ill-fitting joint at the top of the engine cowl. To finish it off, I touched up the joint between the cover and the engine cowl so it would be more consistent with the kit's heavy panel lines. One additional issue with the oil and fuel tank cover is this sort of half moon that doesn't make much sense. It should actually be a full circle, so you need to rescribe the bottom to close the circle. The demand for an earlier Mark 14 with the typical Malcolm-style hood is so great that no sooner had this kit hit the shelves than modelers were plotting how to make the conversion. Every scheme that I saw presented involved cutting up a donor kit, but I thought it'd be much simpler and easier to sidestep the transplant surgery and keep the modifications to just what's needed. For this approach, it's easier to dig out a surplus canopy, although you could vacuum form one. However, if you've built any of the newer Spitfires, you no doubt have one lying around. Here are a few options. The windscreen and hood from the Airfix 5B pretty much drop fit, but the sides of the closed hood have never seemed to conform to the fuselage sides very neatly, not even in the 5B kit. If you're going with the open canopy, it should work just fine, or you could get away with just using the kit windscreen as well. The Edward hood meets up pretty well with the stock kit windscreen, and I like the better adaptation to the fuselage sides, so this is the combination that I'll be using. From some of the reporting I've read, there seems to be a significant variation in the molding quality of this kit, but in all four of mine there's an identical notch in the port side canopy rail. I assume it's a short shot because it isn't in the separate door, but if this affects your kit and you're doing the model with the hood open and the side door closed, then you'll need to fix it. I'm doing a closed canopy, so I'll be removing the top of the rails anyway. To get a better idea of how little is necessary, I took the contour off the Airfix Mark 5B using the technique that I show in my video when a contour gauge isn't good enough. Here you can easily see the amount to be added is relatively small and makes the task appear a lot less daunting. I started by filling the camera port, and I did this with a mixture of cyanoacrylate and acrylic resin powder. This is a very quick and easy technique that I demonstrate in my video on dental acrylic resin. The result's a structurally sound and stable addition with no solvent softened joint. I assembled the basic structure of the cockpit and tried it in to get a better feel for how things lined up. Masking tape was used to mark the cut, and the edges were refined with a sandpaper block. Using the basic cockpit structure, I marked off and reduced the canopy rails. Here you can see the fit of the canopy using the kit's applied windscreen and Edward hood. If you're doing an open hood, some of these fit issues might not be important to you. I boxed in the canopy with 2 pieces of 40,000 styrene. Using a technique that I demonstrated in the Fabrication 101 video, I fashioned a spine from basswood. Here's the result after an initial roughing out. The rear of the center line was aligned with the joint in the fuselage, while the forward end was aligned with a string passed between the halves of the vertical stabilizer and over the joint at the front end of the engine cowl. The shape was refined and blended into the existing fuselage with a combination of files and sandpaper. Every kit ever produced seems to have a different take on the contours of a Spitfire. In the area of the spine, certainly no exception. I think the Airfix 5B gets pretty close, but I think they may have exaggerated the concavity a bit. In any case, here's your chance to put your own personal stamp on the shape. When you get it where you think it looks good, seal the basswood with a coat or two of cyanoacrylate. This penetrates the wood and sands out to be a nice smooth surface. I wasn't happy with how the slot for the canopy rail was developing, so I made a cut through the slot and slipped in a piece of 10/1000 brass shim. I then flowed in a little mixture of cyanoacrylate and acrylic resin to fill in the gaps. After it set up, I cut off the excess with a blade and pulled out the brass. Any further excess was simply sanded back. I hit it with a little lacquer primer, and I lucked out and things looked pretty good. So I sanded it down and used a combination of files to restore the panel lines. The files do a good job of representing the kit panel lines. Files also work better over dissimilar materials, so depending on how thick the layer of cyanoacrylate is, you might find the files easier to handle. A piece of 10,000 styrene was cemented into the canopy rail slot. Once the external portion of the spine's done, the inside material is removed. Because my model will be posed in flight with a closed cockpit, I'm only adding a minimum of detail behind the seat. What's more important in my case is the external appearance. So once I get the canopy in place, I'll do my final blending into the fuselage, reprime the area, scribe in the hatch behind the cockpit, and add the canopy flashing that extends over the fuselage side. But as far as the basic conversion, that's about it for a pretty straightforward approach. So if you have a spare Spitfire hood, a little styrene and basswood, or maybe even leftover chopsticks, you might want to give this simple solution a try. And if nothing else, I hope some of these techniques give you some ideas that you can use for your next project. I've included the links to the various topics mentioned throughout this video in the description below. So long for now, and I'll see you next time.